Andre Collins sat in the living room of the house he had fought so hard to keep. The same house where he had once lived with his wife. The same house where they had raised 2 children. A football game had just ended, and while flipping through channels, he stopped on a national morning show. A smiling host stood beside a woman receiving a standing ovation from the audience. Andre nearly dropped the remote. Because he knew that woman. Her name was Mary. And 1 year earlier, he had left her with almost nothing. No house. No car. No savings. No future. At least that's what he thought. Now millions of Americans were hearing her story. And the entire audience was cheering. What Andre saw next would become the moment he regretted most. But to understand how Mary ended up on national television, we need to go back to the day everything fell apart. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For 23 years, Mary Collins believed she had a stable life. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't famous. But she was happy. At least most of the time. She lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Her days followed a familiar rhythm. Morning coffee. Work. Family dinners. Weekend cookouts. Holiday gatherings. The kind of life millions of Americans build one day at a time. Mary worked part-time at a local community center. The pay wasn't impressive, but it allowed her to be present for her children while they were growing up. Andre had always earned more money. Over time, he became the primary financial provider. At first, that arrangement worked. Then something changed. The conversations became shorter. The laughter became less frequent. The distance between them grew. Friends noticed it. Family noticed it. Even their children noticed it. But nobody expected what happened next. Because behind closed doors, the marriage was already collapsing. And Mary had no idea how bad things were about to become. The announcement came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Andre wanted a divorce. The words hit Mary like a freight train. At first she thought it was anger. Then frustration. Then a phase they would eventually work through. But Andre had already made up his mind. Within weeks, lawyers became involved. The process turned ugly. Every conversation felt like a battle. Every document felt like another loss. Months passed. Court hearings followed. Legal fees mounted. And then came the final judgment. The house went to Andre. The newer vehicle went to Andre. Most of the savings went to Andre. By the time the dust settled, Mary walked away with little more than her personal belongings and $300. $300. After 23 years of marriage. Friends offered sympathy. Family offered encouragement. But sympathy doesn't pay bills. And encouragement doesn't put food on the table. For the first time in her adult life, Mary felt completely alone. What she didn't know was that her lowest moment was about to reveal her greatest opportunity. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Mary sat in a small rented room looking through old boxes. Most of what she owned could fit into a single corner. Photographs. Letters. Memories. And one worn notebook. The notebook had belonged to her grandmother, Opal Johnson. The cover was faded. The pages were stained. Some recipes had handwritten notes in the margins. Others had corrections added decades later. To most people, it looked like an ordinary recipe book. To Mary, it was priceless. Her grandmother had raised her. She had taught her how to cook before she was tall enough to reach the stove. Mary remembered standing on a wooden stool while Opal explained ingredients, flavors, and patience. But Opal had taught her something more important than cooking. She taught resilience. Whenever life became difficult, Opal would say, "Nobody can take what's inside your hands and your heart." Mary stared at the notebook. Then an idea entered her mind. At first it sounded ridiculous. Then impossible. Then maybe, just maybe, it could work. The following week, Mary spent nearly every dollar she had left. She bought ingredients, plastic containers, a folding table, a small banner. When she finished, less than $20 remained. It was the biggest gamble of her life. If it failed, she had no backup plan. At 5 o'clock one Saturday morning, she arrived at a busy roadside location. The air was cold. The streets were quiet. And fear sat heavily in her stomach. Hours passed. Nobody stopped. Then one customer walked over. An older truck driver. He ordered a plate. Mary watched nervously as he took his first bite. His expression changed immediately. He smiled. Finished the meal. Then bought 2 more plates to take home. Before leaving, he said something Mary would never forget. "This tastes like something my grandmother used to make." That single sentence gave her hope. And hope turned out to be exactly what she needed. Because the next few months would test her more than ever. Success didn't happen overnight. Far from it. Some days she sold almost nothing. Some days rain ruined business completely. Equipment broke. Expenses piled up. Doubt followed her everywhere. There were nights when she cried herself to sleep. Moments when quitting seemed like the smartest option. But every morning she got up and tried again. Something interesting started happening. Customers began returning. Then they brought friends. Those friends brought family members. Word spread. People weren't just buying food. They were buying comfort. Memories. A connection to home. Slowly, the tiny roadside table became a local favorite. And then something unexpected happened. A local newspaper wrote a story about her. The article changed everything. A week after the article appeared, Mary received a phone call. At first she assumed it was a customer. It wasn't. The caller worked for a regional television station. They wanted to feature her story. Mary was stunned. The segment aired 2 weeks later. Viewers loved it. The response was overwhelming. Business exploded. Lines stretched down the sidewalk. People traveled from neighboring towns. Some came because of the food. Others came because they were inspired by her journey. Mary worked harder than ever. Then another phone call arrived. This one was different. This one came from New York. National television. Millions of viewers. A major morning show. And they wanted Mary as a guest. She could hardly believe it. But while her life was changing, Andre knew none of it. Not yet. The studio lights were brighter than Mary imagined. The audience was larger. The cameras felt intimidating. But she wasn't there to impress anyone. She was there to tell the truth. When the host asked about the divorce, Mary answered honestly. When asked about losing everything, she answered honestly. When asked what kept her going, she held up her grandmother's recipe book. The audience fell silent. Then she shared the lessons Opal had taught her. About resilience. About dignity. About starting over. Many people in the audience were crying. When she finished speaking, the crowd rose to its feet. A standing ovation. Mary smiled through tears. 1 year earlier she had wondered how she would survive. Now millions of Americans were applauding her courage. And hundreds of miles away, someone else was watching. Andre had no intention of watching Mary that morning. He happened to change channels at exactly the wrong time. Or perhaps the right time. The moment he saw her face, he froze. There she was. Confident. Successful. Admired. The woman he had assumed would struggle for years. The woman he believed would never recover. Now she was inspiring the entire country. As the audience applauded, Andre sat speechless. For the first time, he realized something. The house hadn't made him successful. The car hadn't made him successful. The money hadn't made him successful. The strength he underestimated in Mary had always been there. He simply never saw it. As the audience rose to its feet, Mary tried to hold back tears. 1 year earlier she had been sitting alone in a tiny rented room wondering how she would survive another week. Now millions of Americans were hearing her story. The host smiled. The audience applauded. And for a brief moment, it felt like the journey was finally over. But Mary had no idea that someone else was watching. Someone she hadn't spoken to in over a year. Someone who had watched every second of the interview. And what that person would do next would change everything. Because 3 days after the broadcast aired, Mary received a phone call she never expected. A phone call that would force her to confront the past she thought she had left behind forever. As the audience rose to its feet, Mary tried to hold back tears. 1 year earlier she had been sitting alone in a tiny rented room wondering how she would survive another week. Now millions of Americans were hearing her story. The host smiled. The audience applauded. And for a brief moment, it felt like the journey was finally over. But Mary had no idea that someone else was watching. Someone she hadn't spoken to in over a year. Someone who had watched every second of the interview. And what that person would do next would change everything. 3 days later, Mary was closing up for the evening when her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it. The number wasn't saved in her contacts. But something made her answer. Hello? For a moment, there was only silence. Then she heard a voice. A voice she hadn't heard in over a year. Mom? Mary froze. Her knees nearly gave out beneath her. It was her daughter, Emma. The same daughter she had barely spoken to since the divorce. The same daughter who had slowly drifted away during all the fighting. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Emma broke the silence. I saw you on TV. Mary felt tears forming instantly. Out of everything that had happened during the past year, nothing hit her harder than those 4 words. Not the standing ovation. Not the interviews. Not the success. Just hearing her daughter call her mom again. I'm proud of you, Emma continued. Mary covered her mouth. For months she had wondered if her daughter blamed her for the divorce. For months she had worried that the distance between them would never heal. But now, for the first time, she felt hope. Then Emma said something unexpected. Mom, there's something else. Mary wiped away her tears. What is it? Emma hesitated. Dad saw the interview too. The words hung in the air. Mary wasn't sure how to respond. She hadn't spoken to Andre in months. The thought of him watching the broadcast felt strange. What did he say? She finally asked. Emma paused. Nothing at first. But after it ended, he just sat there. He didn't move. He didn't change the channel. He just stared at the television. Emma explained that Andre had watched the entire interview from beginning to end. When Mary talked about sleeping on a friend's couch, he watched. When she talked about using her last $300, he watched. When she held up her grandmother's recipe book, he watched. And when the audience stood and applauded, he watched that too. For a long time afterward, he said nothing. Then he quietly stood up and walked out of the room. According to Emma, he looked like a man carrying a weight he couldn't put down. For the first time in years, Mary didn't feel angry. She didn't feel bitter. She didn't feel victorious. She simply felt at peace. Because she finally understood something. Success wasn't about proving Andre wrong. It never had been. The business wasn't revenge. The television interview wasn't revenge. The applause wasn't revenge. The real victory was surviving. The real victory was rebuilding a life when everything seemed lost. A few weeks later, Mary received an invitation to speak at a national conference honoring entrepreneurs who had overcome adversity. Hundreds of people attended. Some were business owners. Some were community leaders. Others were ordinary people searching for hope. As Mary stood on stage, she looked across the crowd. Then she noticed a familiar face. Emma. Her daughter smiled and waved. Mary smiled back. At that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the television appearance. Not the awards. Not the recognition. The thing she thought she had lost forever was sitting right there in the audience. Her family. Years later, when reporters asked Mary about the moment that changed her life, most expected her to mention national television. Others assumed she would talk about her business success. Instead, she always gave the same answer. The day my daughter called me. Because that was the moment she realized she hadn't lost everything after all. Sometimes life takes away the things we think we need, only to reveal the things that matter most. And for Mary, that phone call was worth more than the house. More than the car. More than the money. It gave her back something she thought was gone forever. Hope.